I was at my home after a class, and I saw it on live streaming media, which is based in the United States, Tigray Media House, and I was shocked. I never imagined in my life to see such kind of killings with a pleasure on the other side. They were just pointing them. They were just killing them at a point blank range, in a most brutal way, and they were throwing them out. It was the most painful. Let alone for my home community. It's something that I never want to be happen in any part of the world. It's the most cruel. It's the most demeaning. That time there was a limited communication with Tigray because the federal government was in control of the region, and there was a very scarce communication. And I tried to contact my friends and family out there.
Yeah,
they know nothing. They know that they are youngsters who are kidnapped by the Ethiopian National Force soldiers, but they don't know whether they are dead or not.
Tell me, how did it feel to watch those videos, thinking that some of the people in the videos you might know?
All right. It's words fails me to express my feeling. Actually, I was very angry. First, I tried to deny it's something that's never happened. I wish it was a propaganda, or it was something something made up, or mistake.
Yeah.
I wish it was not real, but something it was reality. And the victims people were not allowed to see the whereabouts of their loved ones. They were not allowed to bury them.
Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is the podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. You've just heard from Biniam, an Ethiopian living in Canada who was born and raised in the town of Mahberi Dego in Tigray, where Ethiopia's current civil war began at the end of 2020. The events he describes have become known as the Mahberi Dego massacre. Dozens of civilian men were rounded up and murdered by soldiers of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, or at least by men dressed in the same uniform. They videoed the executions. One soldier, caught on camera, refers to the footage as a souvenir. The soldiers stayed in the town, but did not tell the town's residents what they had done. Confirmation of the men's fate only came months later, and in the worst possible way. The murdered men's bodies had been left to wild animals, and it was only when vultures, dogs, and hyenas were spotted around the outskirts of the town carrying human remains that the residents realized the truth about their families. Only when the soldiers eventually left were the people of Mahberi Dego finally able to start the grisly task of identifying the dead. Among them were 3 men who Biniam describes as being like brothers to him.
One was a university graduate. His name is Meles. I know his father was a priest, and he used to visit our home. He was like his father was like a father to us, and that guy was very, very humble and nice guy. He was doing good at school. He recently graduated, and the other one was killed with his brother. He was a public health graduate. He was very senior, and his brother was a very scholar in religion. Their father was a priest, but his young brother was very he had a big milestone in the religion. And the third one was Halafum. He was the youngest, I guess, from them. He might be 14 or 15. And he was also very close with me when I was in Mahabradegwa. I am born and raised in Mahabradegwa.
Yeah.
And he was working at a private as far as I know, and he was in school. But most of them I know, and I learned that like 4 more of them are also very close to me. So they become 7 now. It was a crime against humanity for killing people who have no any contact with whatsoever military group or anything. They dragged them from their own house. But for that reason, my brother was one of my own brother, little brother, was one of the young people that was chased after them in the town. They was chased the young boys and the men in the town, and my brother fled to the direction of the church in the town, which is to the north of northwest area, and he told me that there was soldiers following them and shooting on the after them on the air, like to intimidate them, and they will stay and they will be caught by them. Fortunately, he just escaped. That's why he was not part of the victims. Otherwise, it would be another story. He was lucky. He escaped. If he were waited, it would be one of those victims.
What do you think should happen to the people who did this?
I am still demanding a justice, and the perpetrators has to come to they should face a justice instead of emboldening them or putting both sides in statement. They should be accountable for their crime. The most cruel part of the massacre was first they were filming it in purpose, so that it can be a purpose to terrorize the people, not to have any link with TPLF or the Tigray forces. And then they were like inviting every one of the brigade's member to participate in the killing. Even the women soldiers, they were encouraging them to participate in the killing. So, and after the massacre, they throw the body down the cliff. And also, one of my friends told me that after even they killed them, they try extra mile to cover any footage or any evidence by beheading them. After they kill them, they cut their heads off and they collect all the skulls in one area and the other bodies in the other. So they destroy a house of a farmer from surrounding, and they took the wound from that house and they burned the corpse together, so that there could not be any way to trace the number of victims. So it's the most cruel thing, It's I sometimes word fails me to express the hate and the cruelty. It's they went far. So
I mean, I've seen some of the videos, and as you say, the cruelty is astonishing because it doesn't seem like it is something that is done purely for military purposes. There's a joy in some of the language that the soldiers seem to use. There's a desire to hurt, and it's done in such a casual way, I think. It sounds like you think it might be a while before there is any justice because of the way the massacres were carried out and covered up.
Right. And it's very very hard. Especially the government, the Ethiopian government, is who had the upper hand, is trying to cover every crimes, even though they suggest that they will hold accountable some of the soldiers that commit crime all over the Tigray, but it seems not near as far as Ethiopian government is blocked Tigray from access of any investigations. Even now with with the total blockade, with there is no communication from to Tigray. There are a lot of investigations in Mahabharadigo massacre, starting from CNN, BBC, Bellingcat, and now New Lines. So even though the crimes are that are big, that can be mounted to the crime against humanity, but the justice doesn't seem very near.
Biniam is just one of millions of Ethiopians affected by the ongoing civil war between the central government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is usually known as the TPLF. The TPLF have dominated politics in Ethiopia since 1991, when a TPLF-led coalition of regional rebel groups took power and established a federal system of ethnic homelands, having overthrown the old communist regime. This arrangement persisted until 2019, when Abiy Ahmed was elected as the coalition's leader. In a bid to counter Tigrayan dominance of the government, Abiy reformed the coalition's ethnically divided parties into a single, centralized prosperity party. The TPLF vehemently refused to participate and, after the pandemic prompted delays to the 2020 regional elections, held elections anyway in open defiance of the federal government. The subsequent showdown quickly escalated into what one Ethiopian general described as a very dirty war. Since it began, millions have been displaced. The Mahabharadigo massacre is just one of a series of mass killings committed by both sides. Sexual violence has been widespread, and the government stands accused of using starvation as a weapon of war. In November, Abiy's government declared a state of emergency in the face of Tigrayan advances on the capital. Last week, with the Tigrayan defense forces on retreat, Abiy announced it would be lifted ahead of schedule. UN officials have called it an opportunity for peace, but many Tigrayans feel it may instead end in genocide. I was put in touch with Biniam by Zecharias Zelalem, a freelance journalist from Ethiopia who reported on the Mahabharadigo massacre for New Lines and who has covered the Tigray war since its inception. Zecharias says that the massacre is just one of many that UN investigators have so far downplayed or ignored in their reports.
The massacre of Mahabharadigo was one of several which investigators from the UN, as well as their partners in the Ethiopian government-run Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, had promised to probe throughout their 6 or 7 months of investigating in Tigray. Prior to their probe being released, Ethiopia's embassy in the UK had reacted by stating that journalists should not rush to conclusions and that the probe would address what is seen in the video. And I believe the ambassador even is on record as saying that they condemned the violence, sort of in an ambiguous way, as if to suggest that the perpetrators might not be Ethiopian soldiers.
Right.
Unfortunately, the UN report, which came out in November of last year, did not make any citation of one of the most well-documented atrocities, which is a joke in itself, and it's the primary reason why it's on the receiving end of so much criticism from Tigrayans and international observers alike.
When did you first hear reports of a massacre at Mahabharadigo?
So, like the majority of Ethiopian social media users, and Ethiopians as a whole, really, the first I heard of it was when those horrendous, gruesome video clips first surfaced on Twitter, on Telegram, and on Facebook. So this would be early March 2021, approximately. Yeah, about 2 months after the massacre actually took place.
And then you went through the process of trying to verify what happened. I mean, the images that you're talking about, in some ways they're very clear, but in some ways they're sort of grainy. It's not entirely clear what's happening. There's extended video evidence of some sort of massacre taking place, but it's not entirely obvious who the people are in the video. And to some degree, the Ethiopian army has used this as a way to say that they were not involved in it.
Yes. When the images first surfaced, I guess I could say it led to a race of sorts between different news outlets to work to authenticate the images and to correctly interpret what was going on, what was depicted. So I was among the many journalists who worked with the specialists, and I managed to geolocate the images, thanks in no small part to residents of Maradego who were able to provide me very helpful tips, especially with the mountain terrain that you can see in the video.
Yeah.
I actually managed to identify the locations even prior to much of the reporting that was later published a month later by the likes of Bellingcat. I did not immediately come up with my findings because I was of the belief that any story would have to include the voices of victims, the voices of residents, and eyewitnesses. And as any journalist would tell you, it was almost impossible to be able to get people in Tigray on record during those initial months of the war where telecommunications were down, journalists and aid workers were barred from the region. Hence the delay in my publishing any body of work on the story.
They were frightened. Of course, they were frightened for their own lives. I mean, they thought the army might come back.
Definitely, definitely. When the images surfaced, the Ethiopian army was still in control of the entire town and its surroundings, and it was really after after June, July of 2020, when the Tigrayan forces were able to recapture much of Tigray, including the town of Mahabaradego, that we had a chance to really be able to connect um, with with residents of Mahabaradego without fearing any reprisals. But the challenge, of course, that came with that was that after the Tigrayan forces took over Mahabaradego, the Ethiopian government cut off all remaining phone lines, the very limited phone lines to the region, making it very difficult to connect with people who were still in Tigray. But we were able to accumulate enough interviews during the 2-3 months, despite the challenges, despite the fears, and of course, it is the primary reason why we've used pseudonyms throughout our reporting for New Lines magazine.
And of course, we still haven't reached the stage where the Ethiopian army has accepted responsibility. They are still saying things like they've used what is essentially the fake news defense, saying the uniforms were stolen and the soldiers were actors and this kind of talk.
Yes, an Ethiopian military official, a military spokesman, Major General Mohammed Tasamma, is on record as saying that the whole thing was faked and that they were actors who played out what was seen in the video. I mean, this is rubbing salt in the wounds of the countless family members who can recognize their loved ones in those video clips.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you say in the article, which I think is very powerful, that there are people who can actually see the videos of their sons and their fathers being murdered.
Definitely. I mean, they made it very clear that it made the healing process very difficult because the massacre in Mahabaradego was one of a slew of atrocities that took place over the course of the first 6-7 months of 2021. Similar massacres were reported all across the Tigray region. There was ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, ethnic cleansing in northern Tigray, near the northern central Tigray, near this Eritrean border. The massacre per se was not an outlier. I guess what makes it different is just the fact that it was documented and archived by video. But of course, unlike the victims of other massacres, this was widely shared on social media, and the images of the brutal executions will be impossible to scrub from the internet. So, yeah, it makes for a very horrid healing process for scores of families.
And this is the criticism that you make in the essay, that the UN has been selective in the way that they have reported the various massacres, not the one at Mahabaradego. What do you think is missing from the picture that these investigations have painted?
Well, it goes without saying that the joint investigative team was obviously not entirely independent. You do have a state-sanctioned human rights watchdog um, involved with the investigative process, which is an entity that ethnic Tigrayans, who bore the bulk of the casualties, do not trust, or most ethnic Tigrayans are unanimous in their belief that the Ethiopian state entity, is out there to whitewash the various atrocities, the various crimes, and in essence, it is what happened. A number of atrocities were completely ignored, while others were whitewashed or downplayed. I believe there was another massacre in the town of Bora, which journalists had reported had left up to 170 or 180 dead, and I think the UN probe um, acknowledged that an atrocity took place and put the death toll as low as 60 or 70. So once again, it definitely highlights the lack of impartiality with the joint investigative team.
I wanted to ask you about the ethnic dimension to the conflict. It's become something of a cliche for Western media, reporting on the Middle East and Africa, to attribute the bloodshed to sort of ancient hatreds or start talking about some sort of tribal war. And it makes it difficult to talk about these things in a way that captures the reality and the nuances of the situation. In Ethiopia, I mean, prior to this war, ethnicity and politics have always been quite linked under this system of ethnic federalism. But you were making the point that actually ethnic federalism is very recent, but the conflicts between ethnicities is much older.
Yes, I mean, well, the first thing is that the various ethnicities that are impacted, the various ethnic groups impacted by the ongoing civil war, are peoples who have coexisted in harmony for decades, if not centuries. In particular, the Tigray and Amhara regions, especially along the border where some of the common regional border where some of the worst atrocities and ethnic cleansing have taken place. The communities there intermingled, and it was very common to hear both languages both the Amharic and Tigrinya languages of the two peoples being spoken concurrently by the natives of the area. Unfortunately, partisan politics, worsening tensions between the political leaders, and the widening political divide resulted in the social fabric of these peoples being torn, completely shredded over the course of the past year and a half. Most observers are of the belief that things did not have to descend into what they became this quickly, this rapidly. Ethnic federalism has something of a necessary compromise in Ethiopia, which has a history of power struggles between variety of leaders, even warlords of various ethnic backings. So the history and Ethiopia's history does point to ethnic divisions being at the forefront of much of the power struggles, but it did not really dent the ability of the peoples to coexist. However, what we've seen in the past year and a half may have sadly put a nail on the coffin, maybe tragically. Yeah.
Do you think then that ethnic federalism was something of a compromise that just had to be accepted?
At this point in time, it was especially. I mean, when it was enacted in 1996, it might have extended, given a new lease on life to Ethiopia as a country, because it came at a time where numerous armed entities had risen, demanding things like the respect of cultural and language rights, self-autonomy, things that had been denied over the course of a century's worth of rule under successive central governments. So ushering in a new government that was resigned to maintaining the previous system, in which Ethiopia's various ethnic groups did not have their languages and their cultures acknowledged or recognized by the constitution, that likely would have resulted in a resumption of the civil war that ended in 1991. So yes, it was a necessary compromise. Of course, the government that did that did finally enshrine the constitution ended up being an authoritarian regime that ruled the country with an iron fist for much of the succeeding 27 years. However, it's something that the ethnic federalism aspect of the constitution is really something that just needs proper enacting. It's not something that needs a removal. But of course, this is something that we would have been speaking of a year or two prior to the Civil War. At this point,
because now you feel that the conflict means that ethnic federalism isn't going to be accepted going forward.
Well, it's more like the compromises, and the compromises might need to be greater this time around. You have more and more voices calling for outright independence amongst certain entities. There's a significant section of the Tigray population now that will not accept coexistence under a sole Ethiopian entity. The voices calling for independence that used to be a fringe element of Tigray society are now becoming more and more mainstream, due in no small part to the horrendous massacres meted out against the population by Ethiopian soldiers, allied militias, and soldiers from neighboring Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, Eritrea is part of the story, isn't it? Because it's something that isn't often discussed in the coverage, which, as you say, is portrayed as an internal civil war. But the regime in Eritrea is collaborating very closely. When Abiy Ahmed took the army in, they went in explicitly with Eritreans.
It goes without saying. The Tigrayans and the Tigray region governing Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, the TPLF entity and the ruling party, the regime in Eritrea, have no love lost between each other. They've been feuding for decades, dating back to their fallout, which triggered the 1998-2000 Ethiopian-Eritrean War, which left something like 80,000 people dead. So the Eritrean government essentially blames the TPLF and Tigrayans for their defeat in that war, as well as the decades of economic isolation, diplomatic isolation that they suffered until Abiy Ahmed put pen to paper on the infamous peace treaty of 2018 that restored ties between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But it's quite clear by now that, and despite that peace treaty, Eritrea and its president for 13 years now, Isaias Afwerki, still had an axe to grind with the TPLF and with the Tigrayan leadership. And it is partially why the Eritrean military has been so embedded in Ethiopian military operations and have been so involved in the civil war. And even the problematic UN joint investigative report identified Eritrean soldiers as perpetrators of some of the worst atrocities in the ongoing civil war.
And what is your analysis then of whether the TPLF will seek independence?
Well, that's obviously an issue that would require an end to the war. Would require, because this war has become a quagmire, an unending quagmire. It's not something that will be solved militarily. That's what any observer of the past 15 months worth of bloodshed would tell you. Once there's a mediated settlement, third-party mediators can obviously bring the various factions to an agreement on what the future would look like. Obviously, the Tigrayans will not compromise whatsoever on their hard-fought autonomy, whether that would mean a federated existence under a single Ethiopian entity, or whether Tigray might spend the near future living as an independent but unrecognized entity, a la Somaliland. It's hard to say. I'd be speculating right now, but obviously the first step would be for mediators to get involved, and they are to some extent. There's some very preliminary level movement, which has involved the release of various political prisoners, the release of detained TPLF leaders. but nothing yet that has really borne the sort of fruit which could spell an end to the conflict, which sadly continues to rage on.
It's quite a critical moment now in the conflict, isn't it? You have Tigrayan forces moving back to Tigray. There was a discussion a couple of weeks ago that the state of the emergency would come to an end. And so it feels like there may be an opportunity for a negotiated peace. But what you're saying, it sounds like neither side is going to accept anything close to the status quo that prevailed before, because they might feel that the past year was then wasted.
Definitely. On the side of the Ethiopian government, for the first year or so of the war, the question of negotiations was out of the question. The TPLF has been designated a terrorist organization by Ethiopian parliament, and just arriving to the point and making the concession that roundtable talks are necessary was a massive shift from a massive policy change from the stance maintained over the course of the past year. When, like, at the height of the fighting, the Ethiopian government continued to maintain that it was conducting mop-up operations of a finished force and that negotiations were no longer necessary. I think it could be perhaps upon Tigrayan forces coming within 200 kilometers of the capital city that the question of negotiations became an inevitable reality in Addis Ababa. Nevertheless, publicly, the saber rattling continues on both sides. And recently we had an Ethiopian military commander go out on state television and promise viewers that Ethiopian forces would go back into Tigray and retake the capital city. So, as I said, with that sort of saber rattling, you don't see the sort of compromising approach that both sides need to be able to reach an agreement, to reach the sort of settlement that would address the very, very dire humanitarian situation on the ground, which is arguably the worst in the world today. So you still have 500,000 people in need of food aid, 500,000 people that are exposed to famine, and due to fighting, due to an Ethiopian military enacted blockade, aid agencies have not been able to deliver the necessary. I think the statistic was something like 150 trucks daily deliveries of food aid to the region. So yes, we are far from, despite the somewhat promising signs, publicly, both sides still appear to be on a war footing, and on the ground as well, especially on the Afar front, fighting has intensified in recent days. So some of that optimism has given way for pessimism in recent weeks.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your own the impact that the conflict has had on you. When we were talking before about how difficult it was, and you felt that you needed to leave for a period of time, but also that other journalists Ethiopian journalists have been arrested, other journalists have been expelled. It's a very, very difficult conflict to report on. I wondered if you felt that there were times when you'd had concerns for your own safety, or if you feel that it might be difficult one day to go back.
Well, obviously, over the course of the past 6 months or so, the very narrow space that had been available for journalists to operate in has nearly dissipated. Ethiopia has once again returned to its former status as one of the top jailers of journalists in the world. So many of our colleagues have quit their work. Others have been detained. I think something like 40 journalists had been detained over the course of 2021. And the few others who are still operating in Ethiopia have either watered down their work or are working without bylines. It has been impossible to operate freely under the extremely repressive atmosphere. Personally, as someone in exile, I'm not someone that concerned about my safety. I do have colleagues, friends, including fellow journalist Lucy Casa, who was assaulted by plainclothes security officers in Addis Ababa when she began investigating the weaponized rape and the systemic gender-based violence by Eritrean soldiers. So obviously, I'd have to pay tribute to the journalists who carried out their work on the ground, who faced the real risks, the very real risks of arrest, of suffering bodily harm. And those of us on the outside, I mean, obviously we come on the receiving end of daily death threats, online abuse, slander. It's part of the job. We grow accustomed to it. It's not the most pleasant thing in the world, but I obviously have to acknowledge that my privileged position as someone who's out of the reach of much of the entities that clamp down on journalists. As someone who does not hail from any of the warring regions, I don't have the same. I don't deal with the same levels of trauma as some of my fellow colleagues who've spent 6 or 7 months unable to communicate with their families on the ground, unaware of whether their families are eating or are caught up in airstrikes or in crossfire. I don't have that. I don't have those fears. Obviously, when the war, when there was a credible threat of the war encroaching on Addis Ababa, where the capital city, where all of my family and friends live on, of course, that's when my own fears heightened, because we're talking about warring factions, all of whom have very poor track records when it comes to human rights. So my fears have obviously subsided since the rebels have been pushed away from the capital city. As I said, I think I have it better off than many of my colleagues.
That was Zecharias Zelalem. The crackdown against journalists that Zecharias describes has made it challenging to find reliable information on the conflict, which is, of course, the government's intention. Since the civil war started, according to Reporters Without Borders, dozens of journalists have been arrested. While it is Ethiopian journalists who have suffered the worst from the crackdown, even international media has been affected by the government's efforts to suppress independent reporting. At New Lines, we saw the chilling effect of the government's policy for ourselves in the process of preparing this episode, when some of the potential guests we reached out to elected not to speak to us, citing uncertainty about the consequences. Julia Steers, our next guest, is one of the few reporters from an international media outlet to be allowed to cover the war from the ground. She's a correspondent for Vice News and chief of the company's bureau in Kenya. She reported from Ethiopia in September of last year. I spoke to her from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, and began by asking her about how she managed to get into Ethiopia, given the government's hostility to reporters. The process, she says, was far from easy.
Yes, we tried to get into Ethiopia since the outbreak of the war in November of last year. And we did this a variety of ways, both lobbying the federal government directly and then obviously working with the Tigrayan leadership to see if there were any ways in on that side, up to and including going to the border of Sudan and Tigray to see if there were any opportunities to go that way. Ultimately, we were rejected 3 times for visas via the federal government. But in August of last year, while I was actually reporting on the border of Sudan and Ethiopia, I received a call from the Prime Minister's office, who, after months of sort of directly lobbying the spokesperson of the Prime Minister's office, they allowed us to come and specifically to go report in the Amhara region.
And do you have a sense of why at that point they were keen to get international media in?
I think at that point, there was enough negative coverage that it was starting to affect them, despite the fact that every time there was a negative report out of Tigray, they immediately sort of hit back with accusations of fake news and rejecting the validity of the reporting. I do think it was a turning point in several ways. One, in their recognition that it was getting quite bad in the international spotlight for the federal government. And then also it was just before the renewal of Abiy's term, the swearing in of a new government, and around the same time that they were lobbying for mass mobilization for people to fight back against the TPLF presence, both in the Amhara and the Amhara region. So it was a turning point in several ways, and I think they felt they had something to say. The narrative was obviously very specifically inviting us to the Amhara region to show us the damage that TPLF forces had wrought in that region. And that was very explicit when they invited us to come. And then, of course, when we were reporting on the ground, we had minders and we had, frequent reminders from the communications ministry that the reason we were there was to report on the toll of what they said was TPLF destruction against Amhara civilians.
Yeah, they've tried very hard to control the narrative from the very beginning.
Yeah, and to a large extent, they've been quite successful. I mean, the media blackout and the all-out blockade of Tigray has been unfortunately quite successful in both limiting the reporting and by virtue of that controlling the narrative. And then, of course, through social media and through their own sort of press strategy, they've tried to control the narrative very tightly. And we felt that on the ground, and we agreed to report there knowing that what we were seeing was through a very particular lens, but also knowing that reporting opportunities had been so limited that, it would be foolish, obviously, not to take up an offer to report on the ground.
Yeah. You did report from a Tigrayan refugee camp near the Ethiopian border. I wonder if you have a sense of how Tigrayans were seeing the conflict there. Was there a lot of support for the TPLF, or did people just really want it to be over so they could go home?
So the answer to that is sort of both. And one of the most interesting parts of my reporting over the last year was actually seeing the shift in my 2 reporting trips to the camps in Eastern Sudan, right on the border with Tigray. I went about a month after the outbreak of the war, and then I went again about 10 months later in August. And right after the outbreak of the war, the sentiment was very much, all we want to do is go back to our home, go back to our lives. This war caught us by surprise, and we just want to go back. And we've been living, as a united Ethiopia, we've been living next to the Amhara people for decades, and we just want to go back to that. I really cannot overemphasize the shift in tone in the 10 months that followed as they received more and more news about what was going on at home. When we reported from there in August of this year, the shift was really, towards much, much greater support of the TPLF, much more sort of hardened viewpoints, a lot of talk about revenge, a lot of talk about their children taking revenge on the regime of Abiy Ahmed and against the federal government. So you certainly saw in the camps a real hardening in terms of sentiment against the federal government and a huge support for the TPLF. There were many, many reports, some of which we were able to confirm ourselves, of young men leaving the camps to join the fight, to cross back over into Tigray and join the fight. So certainly there was big support, and also a real sense of sort of intractability. There was a sense among a lot of the refugees that, actually they might not be able to go home soon, and that the war had gotten much worse than they expected it would.
That's fascinating, and it suggests that the very brutal response from the government actually backfired over that period, that it became so entrenched that you are talking almost about people preparing for generational conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, that made it into some of our reporting. There was a mother who had 2 sons, and I said, what do you hope for the future of your sons? And frankly, I expected her to say to live in a peaceful Ethiopia, and she said quite the opposite. She wanted her sons to go back, to grow up and go back and to fight and to avenge the death of their father, who was killed by federal forces. And, we heard that was a story we heard many times over.
I wonder if part of the reason for that is that so much of the conflict seems to have been carried out against civilians. You visited the site of a massacre in the village of Chena, where the government says Tigrayan forces murdered around 200 civilians. Now, there have been civilian deaths on both sides, but those incidents have not been unusual. The violence against civilians has been very intense.
Yeah, exactly. It's been very intense and it's been very visceral, especially given the mobilization of civilians by the federal government. It's not just the military that was targeting civilians in Tigray, for example, but it was Amhara militias and young men who joined informal militias. So it really, in a sense, it was sort of neighbor to neighbor, civilian to civilian violence, as well as you know from the reporting, really gruesome violence, sexual violence against women and house to house raids. So yeah, I think the government's narrative that they were targeting the TPLF leadership and TPLF forces, despite the lack of reporting, I think that narrative was disproven quite early on in the war, and it became clear that this was being waged on civilians.
When I interviewed Zecharias Zelalem, he said something very similar. He said that actually, despite there being a period when these two regions were living peacefully, he didn't think that was likely to be the case going forward. He thought Tigray might even push for independence or separation. Is that something that you feel, having been on the ground?
Absolutely. I think that was one of the most dispiriting parts of our reporting on both sides, to be honest, both in the camps amongst the Tigrayan refugees and then in Amhara. We were there shortly after the federal government's call for mass civilian mobilization. So everybody pick up whatever weapon you have and join the fight. And of course, the federal government claimed it was the fight against TPLF leadership, but there was a lot of sort of coded language that really made it feel like the fight was against Tigrayans sort of writ large. And it's really hard to see, even if these sort of higher level peace talks are successful, it's very hard to see how you sort of put that genie back in the bottle. The sense of sort of frenzied support for the war effort, the increasingly sort of ethnicized use of language by local politicians, by civilians who we spoke to in Amhara, being on the ground in Amhara at that time, you really got the feeling that everybody was behind the war effort. And the idea that a peace deal could be signed and Amhara civilians and Tigrayan civilians will sort of easily go back to living as neighbors and living as fellow Ethiopians is at this point quite hard to imagine.
It's very worrying. I mean, you hear mixed messages, I think, coming out of the Abiy government. On the one hand, there's this push for a negotiated settlement. The TPLF, of course, the UN wants peace talks and so on. And Abiy's government said, it's going to end the state of emergency. But on the other hand, you have people like the deputy army chief saying people of Ethiopia shouldn't think it's over. The enemy is still here. They have to be eliminated. There's no negotiations. These mixed messages mean realistically that regardless of what international pressure there is, this conflict is not going anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to tell, whether or not Abiy is sort of saying one thing to an international audience, and then in terms of what he's saying to the local politicians who are saying these things, or the local politicians who are continuing to wage war. It's hard to tell if that's coming from Abiy himself, or if, frankly, he's just sort of lost control of all the forces at play. I mean, it's important to remember it's not sort of a traditional war in that he can't just call back the federal forces there. You have Amhara militias, you have the mass mobilization of civilians, you have the involvement of regional militias in Afar and Amhara, you have Eritrean troops on the ground. So certainly I think it's both mixed messages and messages delivered to different audiences, internal audiences versus international audiences. But also, frankly, I'm not sure that the prime minister has control over all of those forces that he sort of recruited and unleashed to help his war agenda.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the propaganda aspect. We talked about how the government is trying to control the narrative, but I thought there was also something quite interesting about the way social media was involved. I mean, even social media beyond Ethiopia, spreading and normalizing some of the rhetoric against both sides. Did you feel when you were there that the way that it was perceived in the outside world was having an influence in stoking the violence?
Definitely. I think the framing of the international community as meddling, which was a narrative we saw a lot on social media, was something we saw on the ground. I mean, we came upon some random seeming rallies against the US, for example, and this was in the week after Abiy had been tweeting that the US and many foreign powers should essentially stay out of Ethiopian affairs. So it was definitely making it back even to small towns in the Amhara region. And then, as you said, the diaspora has been quite active as well in social media messaging and connecting some of those narratives back to what's happening on the ground, which of course, as a reporter, makes it even more difficult because we've been so blocked from the country. And then there's so much propaganda and so much sort of social media manipulation of what's going on both sides that it's difficult to parse through all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this relates to the point you were making earlier about the prime minister. In a way, he's painting himself into a corner because he's talking to two different groups at the same time, internally and externally. And it leads to a situation where it's hard to see him find a way out that will satisfy both audiences.
Certainly. I think this is the most engaged we've seen him with the international community for a long time. He was not only ignoring the international community, but really snubbing many sort of big donors to Ethiopia and previous backers of Ethiopia, the US included. But now, as I said, he has backed himself in a corner to an extent because he's had to rally the support of politicians in Amhara, for example, to get behind the war effort, both, in terms of throwing their money and their resources behind it. And so now, if he's involved in sort of cutting this high-level deal with international intervention, there are many parties, most likely the Amhara elite and the Eritrean president, who's been a huge ally of his, who will not necessarily be happy with that deal. So it's not a very comfortable position for Abiy, that's for sure.
On a personal level, I know you've spoken with some warmth about Ethiopia. Do you think that if the war continues or if it stops and then restarts, do you think you might be able to go back and report?
We're hoping so. We continue to engage with the federal government. We continue to engage with the TPLF side of things, sort of much to the chagrin of the federal government. Obviously, it's difficult on the Tigrayan side because the federal government has labeled them as terrorists. So as journalists, just talking to what they've designated a terrorist group is quite difficult. But I think, the people of Ethiopia deserve clear-headed, objective reporting about a conflict that has been very muddled and very intense, and as we've discussed, wrought primarily against civilians. So hopefully, whether or not there is a peace agreement, we'll be able to get back on the ground soon.
Julia Steers there in Nairobi. What Julia said at the end really is the central question, whether or not there is a peace agreement. More than a year into the war, Ethiopia stands on the brink. By most accounts, the fighting has eased, for now at least. But the humanitarian situation remains as urgent as ever. The United Nations warns that millions are at risk of starvation. Supplies of medicine are alarmingly low. Much of this depends on the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and whether he decides to try to negotiate or to push for victory in a bid to end his TPLF problem once and for all. It would be a dangerous gamble. Such a war would not be easy. But then neither will the peace. As our guests have pointed out, the forces he has unleashed to fight the war cannot easily be controlled or put away. A peace agreement would be a crucial and urgently needed first step. But the traumatic and violent polarization of Ethiopian society, which he has encouraged, will not be easily repaired without a serious and sustained effort towards reconciliation, if Ethiopia truly is to end its very dirty war. Thank you very much to our guests. You can find Zecharias on Twitter at Zecharias Zelalem and Julia at JC Steers. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond, including Zecharias' article, The UN's Purblind Human Rights Reporting in Ethiopia, on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.